Welcome to Breaking Down the Biz, everyone. This is actually the de facto inaugural episode of this. We're not going to be having formal inaugural ceremonies, but as I mentioned earlier, but we are joined by someone who is an incredibly accomplished, special, highly knowledgeable guest who's also a dear friend and colleague of mine from years of working in Latin markets, Mr. Bruno Del Granado. Welcome to you, sir.
Great seeing you again, Seth.
Bruno's joining us from Miami, and I'm sitting here on the other side of the country. And we're going to go into Bruno's background in a good deal of detail. But I thought we could kind of kick things off a little bit just because 4 or 5 days ago, we're still kind of fresh from something that is fairly massive. Bruno, amongst other hats, manages one of the world's biggest and most important artists, Ricky Martin, and was part of a major event at the Super Bowl with Bad Bunny and Gaga. And boy, it made, to me and a lot of people around the country, just an overwhelming impact. And I thought maybe I'd ask you to share a little bit of thoughts on what it was like and what the effect's been just 4 or 5 days out.
Well, Seth, this is the third Super Bowl I'm kind of involved with from the artistic side. Our first one was with Gloria Estefan when she played halftime at the Super Bowl in 1992 here in Miami. Then it was Shakira and Jennifer Lopez in 2020, featuring Bad Bunny and J Balvin, by the way. And now Ricky. It just speaks volumes about the importance of Latin music, Latin culture, and the Hispanic demographic of the United States. This was something that it was in the works for months. Bunny's idea with his team was just, let's celebrate. We're going to show them, instead of being political, instead of being, sending messages, we're just going to show the audience and the general public and all of America and the world what Latin culture is all about. That's why you saw all these different segments with the house, with the bars, with all the weddings and all that. So it's just a celebration of Latin culture. Yeah. And he really hit the ball out of the park on this, literally. And the ratings were huge. The streams have been massive. And usually nowadays, Seth, as you well know, the next day people talk about whatever happened the night before, the day before, for maybe half a day. And then everybody moves on to the next thing. We're on a week and a half after this, and people are still talking about it, still generating views and streams and conversations and all that. So it certainly was a home run.
Yeah, it was one of the interesting things. We'll get into your background in a second, but just, having spent years in Miami with you and others, it is a little bit of a different part of the landscape, even from a corporate perspective. Obviously, there's a different language. There's several languages and lots of accents and regional dialogues throughout the region. And, the performance was all in Spanish. And I think one of the things I was watching and this is me as a music professional, not as anything political, but, I was trying to wonder about, you want to get your message across, right? It's the 127, I don't know what the number was, millions of viewers for this thing. I was thinking, gee, should he put subtitles in the lyrics? But it feels to me like the message did get across, of unity, of love, of pride. I'm not sure anyone really needed the subtitles or any English language in it. You think that's fair?
Seth, you and I have worked together for many years. Remember the Latin explosion when Ricky and Shakira and Enrique and Mark Anthony had to record in English back in 1999 to have a shot at major market crossover, right? Back then, that was rule number one. You have to record in English so you could have a shot. Now you don't have to, because of technology, because of streaming, because of the internet. And plus, Bunny has never recorded in English. So it would have been weird for him to attempt to record in English. They did a couple of years ago, as you well know, when he performed at the Grammys, there was an attempt to subtitle the performance and his acceptance speech, and it felt so flat and so discombobulated. So I think the NFL folks and the producers, Hamish Hamilton, everybody said, just let it be the way it is. Bunny's the biggest artist in the world singing in Spanish, so we're not going to try to filter any of that stuff now. Now, the interesting thing is that going back to the Super Bowl halftime show that Gloria Estefan did in 1992, she opened with a song in Spanish called Oye Mi Canto, which is a big, huge song off an English language album. And it was in Miami, and it was all Spanish, but there was none of this, chatter about why she's singing in Spanish, why she's not singing in English, and all that other stuff. Obviously, we're living in different times now, but it was so natural for Bunny just to do what he does, which is be himself.
No, but that's really cool. Yeah, it's interesting. Even when we were together, in the aughts in
Hmm.
Miami, I mean, I don't know how to put this, but I do remember if it's a bifurcation, if you will, of a dual identity. I mean, Ricky's done stuff obviously in English
Hmm.
and, in Spanish, as has Gloria, right? And if I'm recalling, even some of the other reggaeton artists have done that as well from Puerto Rico, if you will. There is a bit of a dual identity thing right there. Do you think
And
like we're at a point now, whether it's streaming or globalization of music, where that's kind of an irrelevant thing? It doesn't happen or need to happen anymore?
yeah, I think so. I think the internet has certainly, evened out the playing field. So when you have K-pop artists who don't speak English being global, nobody understands what they're singing about. Same thing's happening with Latin. Same thing's happening with Nigerian Afrobeats. But also, let's keep in mind that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So these folks can,
Absolutely.
and in Puerto Rico, you are taught English and Spanish in schools. So these folks grow up being bilingual, bicultural, probably more Puerto Rican because they're on the island. But it is an American, territory.
No, fascinating stuff. So look, the audience should know. Bruno's, let's talk about your background a little bit. But you're principally these days an artist manager for not only
Mhm.
Ricky Martin but Gloria Stefan. I know you from many walks, but you also ran CAA. For
Mhm.
those of you out here that don't know what it is, that's the probably one of the most important talent agencies. But CAA Latin America,
Yeah.
Latin artists, and lots of other stuff with CNN and also with Madonna and Maverick. Maybe just give us a little sense of what the background's like, and we'll keep it kind of brief, but it's really impressive.
I'll give you the bird's eye view really fast. So my career started at CBS Records, Sony Music, which back in the day was part of CBS Inc. As a college rep in the college rep program. From then, I graduated to New York to become a product manager at Columbia Records and Epic. And then, as we always do in the record business, we jump around. I jumped over to Capitol Record, Los Angeles, to do international marketing with a good friend of ours, Tom Corson. And then MTV called me to come to Miami and be part of the launch team in 1993. It was the third MTV O&O. They had launched the US in 1981, the UK in 1987, and they'd done JVs with Brazil. There was an MTV Brazil, but it was a JV with a big media company down there called Abril. And then they did one in Asia with Star.
Hmm.
It was Star TV. So we were technically the third MTV to launch globally that was owned and operated by Viacom at the time. And now, at the peak, there was probably 30 all owned and operated. So I came down just as Latin America was opening up, Seth. Latin America in the early 90s was moving from fixed landlines to mobile. They were so ahead of the
Hmm.
curve in mobile. So you know this better than I do. They were so ahead in the curve in mobile that
Sure.
Movistar from Spain went in, Tim from Italy went in, and they developed the cellular business, and it jumped leaps ahead of the U.S. So the Latin Americans went from not everybody having landlines to everybody having cell phones, and that's what helped music and helped media entertainment load global, right? So we were at the cusp of that at MTV. We were a pan-regional channel, which meant our original feed was seen in Mexico and Argentina, two very diverse markets, because the Mexican rock scene and the Argentine rock scene are very, very different, and they have very little, or they had very little in common. MTV was the glue that put all of that region together music. And it was a great time to be doing it because the music scene was just exploding in Argentina. They just got rid of dictatorship. Mexico was on fire. Colombia, Venezuela,
Ah.
all these countries were incredibly on fire.
Soda Stereo, all those cool bands. Let's just go back a little bit because I sometimes feel like I got into the business after all the fun was over, and the old school stuff had become the new school corporate. I had a really great experience down there in Miami for many years. But like when you look at Latin artists today, and I don't know if Ricky or Bunny are the best examples, but how different is sort of like the idea of the world viewing a Latin artist today than it used to be back, say, in that time. I mean, Julio Iglesias was a big star, right, globally back in the day. Gloria and Ricky were as
Yeah,
well. But is it totally different now?
it's completely different. So Julio and Gloria are anomalies, right? Julio was massive before he moved to the States. Julio realized that in order for him to have a global career, he had to be based in Miami because he geographically had very smart guy. Geographically had said that if he based himself in Miami, in order to do a show in Mexico, he'd go do the show, come back and sleep in Miami, same in Puerto Rico, and it was just much easier for him to live here. The Stepans had been here all the entire time. So back in the day, Seth, and
Yeah.
I'll give you the Shakira example. an artist got signed in a country, Shakira, in Shakira's case, Colombia, right? Colombia, South America. So they had to develop her, Sony Music Colombia had to develop. And then after that, she would jump over to Brazil and Argentina. And little by little, like dominoes, they would try to conquer the entire South American continent and up to Mexico. When they had all of those countries already locked in, then they would attempt to bring them to the States and do what they called crossover. Initially, a Latin crossover within, with the Latin audience in the US. Afterwards, it was a crossover to the general market. So back then, you had to chip away months, if not years, to have a shot at the US
Mm,
market. Now, you
yeah.
could record a song in your bedroom in Medellin, and tomorrow it's global,
Mm.
and day after tomorrow you're like biggest artist in the world.
And this is streaming. I mean, like I think maybe if it's fair to say the kids hear the beat, hear the melody, and they don't care whether it's Korean or Colombian. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I remember an artist named Danny Ocean who
Is
had
it?
a track. I think it came out of Central America, so billions of streams, whatever it might be. And no, that's super cool. And so it's maybe it's much more immediate these days, but there's still the identity. I mean, I think Shakira, if I recall, the first two records sold like hundreds of units to her
Mhm.
family and friends until it was laundry service, right? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
somehow these markets started exploding for her. Maybe the big boys, the big labels in New York come in and pull your artists a little bit. Maybe an Epic or a Columbia will say, "Hey, Sony Latin, we're taking him up to the U.S. now, and he's gone," or they can still retain a little bit of their positioning in the Latin market as well.
For a while, during the late 90s, early aughts, that was the case. If you managed to sell and generate a lot of interest in Latin America and maybe US Hispanic, you'd have on the Sony side an RCA, a Columbia or Epic coming in and picking your artist and moving the contract over to the US side. Now it's not really important or necessary to do that. Um, you know, because
Yeah.
there's no need. It doesn't being signed to RCA or Columbia or Epic doesn't, or Warner Atlantic or whatever, doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to have that big huge shot. You can do it on your own with your own team.
Oh, that's a huge thing.
Mhm.
I think I was telling you, I usually go to the Latin Grammys for different reasons. And I was out this year, actually to say hi to a lot of people and for some meetings. And I go to some of the parties. I recall I went to the Orchards party, just to say hi to people. When I was at Sony, I don't know how to put this, but the Orchard wasn't exactly a priority for us. It was like, those are the garage bands.
Mhm.
I don't really want
Mhm.
to hear it. You wouldn't bring that up in a marketing meeting for
Mhm.
the president. This thing, I guess they're distributing Bad Bunny. They got a lot of others now, but this was like the centerpiece of the whole event. If you ask me, and some of the colleagues there were talking about what they call the distribution plus model, what the Orchard's doing for
Mhm.
artists like Bad Bunny or other
Mhm.
independents, and probably trying to emulate it. Maybe it's changing the whole business. Who knows?
And I think, Seth, a lot has to do with when Napster kind of decimated the music industry. Labels didn't know what to do. So, as you know, because you were at Sony, the first thing they rushed to was let's stop the bleeding and then let's sign artists to a 360 model, which meant not only are we going to make money off the
Mm.
music, but also on the touring, on the brands, on licensing, and everything else. Artists, for a minute, were like desperate enough that they signed to those 360 model concepts. And then they got very smart and said, no, that's not the way
Mm.
to go. I'm just going to run my own ship. And that's when the Orchard and ADA and Cobalt and BMG Rights and Ingrooves, which is now Virgin, suddenly saw this big
Mm.
opening with artists saying, oh, no, 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 I want to own my masters. I just need distribution. I'll take care of everything myself. And that's when the distributors came in and kind of took some of the real like big artists from away from the majors. It's really hard. Majors are now competing. You talk to Sony, you talk to Universal. They're competing internally, the Universal side, with Virgin as to who's going to end up with whoever, whichever artist is the one that they're talking to, right? Same with Sony and the Orchard and Warner with ADA.
Huge difference. So let me pivot a little bit, just kind of a top level general question,
Mhm.
but I think it's fair to say, because both of us have had pretty intimate experience in this business in the Latin American side of things, whether it's the United States Latin market or territories outside the US, it's a really different playing field than the US. Everything
Mhm.
in the business is different. The culture, the karma, the business models. Maybe just a little bit from you on, top level, if you will. How is the business of the Americas different in music than, say, North America or even Europe or some of the other markets?
Well, the first thing is we Latins are not monolithic. So everybody else, Latins are Latins, so we're not. So the way we approach the Latin business set, as you know, it's three different markets. It's Spain, which they call Iberia, Spain and Portugal. It's
Mm,
LATAM, and Brazil kind of comes in and out there. And then there's US Hispanic, which is three different entities. Because, there are over 600 million Latinos in this world. And as you know, an Argentine is very different from a Mexican, very different from a Spaniard. And I think, apart from music, the best example of the differences of the Latinos is when you watch the world, or when you watch soccer games. That's when the real nationalistic pride comes in, because
mm,
apart from that, we're all together. We're all in the same boat. But it's because of that every single market in Latin America and the U.S. Hispanic has to be treated differently. Whereas the U.S. general market is kind of, it's pretty safe and steady and
mm.
predictable in a lot of ways, right? But Latin America is not at all.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, sometimes people look at the region in, I don't know, pieces of four, pieces of five, if you will. Brazil's
Mhm.
always sort of its own piece of it. Mexico and Central America, maybe the Andean region, and then all our friends down in
Yeah,
Argentina.
the Sun going, which is Argentina, Chile.
And all of them have their own artists, right? Their own
Yep.
repertoire.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily reggaeton or trap, but it's got rich histories, right?
Seth, you know what's happening? The other thing with the internet, it's what the term localization, global, local, right? So what we're seeing in South America, like in
Mm,
other markets, is where you look at the top 10, Spotify or whatever, what a streaming outlet you want, and
yeah.
five or six are local artists, and then the rest are either the big Ricky's Bunnies or the Taylor Swift or whatever. So local music globally is such an important part of music business. That's why artists are spending, and labels are spending more money on local artist development. Listen, last year, Seth, actually 2 years ago, 2024, the biggest artist globally on TikTok, not song, biggest song, sorry, for 2024 was a Chilean rap called Floyd Menor, who was not signed to a major
Oh,
label in Chile. He was signed to Steven Stout's and Gerardo's label, United Masters. It was the biggest song for TikTok globally, bigger than anything else in 2020. So we're seeing a lot more of that happen. So the global localization is certainly important in Latin America.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, the last time I was in the region, I was in, Buenos Aires and Bogota with a client. And I remember, Argentina has a strong rock history. Some of its biggest
Mhm.
bands, I mentioned Soda Stereo and Gustavo Cerati, Los Fabulosos Cadillacs. These are, closer to rock bands, if you will, the rock genre. Same thing, Colombia's got its vallenato and artists that are native and important. But man, they were signing trap artists, reggaeton artists. They had local versions of that as
Yeah.
well, and
Yeah.
it was firstly it was astonishing to see it, but regional Mexicans still alive, right? There are the genres haven't gone away entirely in the region, right?
The
Sertanejos, all these local.
No, no. So in Brazil, sertanejo is basically country music, Brazilian country music, if you will. That's the closest thing we can say to describe the genre. It's stadium music. You know how you see in the U.S. Kenny Chesney or George Strait playing
Yeah,
stadiums. It's the same thing in Brazil.
yeah,
Artists like Luan Santana filling out stadiums, 80, 90,000 people. Guy cannot walk down the street in Brazil without being mobbed. He could come to Miami or maybe go to Madrid or whatever, and nobody would know who he is. But that's happening very much. Regional Mexican music, and you know, because of Peso Pluma, Grupo Firme, and Grupo Frontera in the last
mm,
couple of years, this new generation of artists has certainly revitalized the genre. It's no longer what you and I used to know back in the day. So the genre is
yeah,
stronger than ever. And it also has the advantage, Seth, that Mexico is a country of 130 million people. We are 68,
hmm,
65, 70 million Hispanics here, of which about 65% are Mexican American. So you have those two humongous markets of Mexican and Mexican American people who will gravitate automatically to that kind of music. So that's already a huge starting platform for that genre of music.
Bruno, I want to talk a little bit more about the modern landscape, just, today's music market, for sure, the Latin market, to think about what you have to do to break an artist. It's obviously different than 30 years ago, right? Channels like
Mhm.
TikTok and MTV is no longer around. I don't even know if radio promotion's important anymore, but just give me some thoughts, if you will, on what one needs to do to break an artist these days, and how would you go about doing it if you had a new one as opposed to a huge veteran artist?
Well, back in the day, Seth, you needed, for one, to have a good to help you produce your music right. And those producers were extremely expensive, unavailable, and unattainable. Now you don't need that. Like I said, you could record a song from your living room or your bedroom in Medellin, Colombia, upload it to all these different services around the world. And tomorrow morning, you will know if you have a hit or if you don't, right? So artists, what they're doing now, or developing artists in the Latin space, they're constantly dropping music as a test, right, in the market. So every week they drop something. Every week they drop something. And out of maybe five, one sticks, and that's what they build on. And then they start building their own teams. What I've
Mm.
noticed in the Latin space is they're very shrewd and savvy and very smart, these kids nowadays. They build their own team. Back in the day, they would come to you and say, help me with this, help me get a label deal, help me get publishing, help me get a manager. Now it's DIY
Mm.
because of the internet. Back in the day,
Yeah.
when I wanted to join a record company or wanted to work in the music business, I didn't know what was the first step. Now all you got to do is type into the keyboard, chat GPT, AI, and you can get the entire roadmap on how to release a song. You don't need terrestrial radio. You don't need MTV. You do need videos though, because YouTube is bigger than ever, Seth. So it is something that you still have to
Mm.
think about. I need to shoot a video, even if it's a very lo-fi, homemade video. But I do need that because YouTube is,
Yeah.
it's still in Latin America, the best way to expose new music.
Yeah. No, definitely. I know how important. I mean, obviously YouTube's free as well, and that can drive a
Hmm.
lot of usage. But
Yeah.
maybe just you said a bunch of really interesting things there. But classic stuff is also have a music publisher to help you if you're a songwriter, plug your songs, get you synced, maybe give you some guidance and advice, and then of course a record label. Like, you think? I mean, are there those things just like appendages these days, or is there some value? I mean, I'm not talking about any record label in general, but when an artist looks at these things, they must see it differently, is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah. Music publishing has definitely shifted from 20 years ago where it was an afterthought. Now, a lot of these young artists go to music publishing companies, whether it's the big ones or the smaller ones or the local ones, and they will sign first and foremost with a music publisher before they go to record label. Remember back in the day, they would sign with Sony or Warner, MCA, Polygram, and then they'd think about a publishing deal. Now, it really is music publishers are driving a lot of that creativity, a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. The DIY market's interesting to me. The artists I work with these days. I mean, it's easy to publish, and there's lots of platforms that are out there.
Hmm.
But just the amount of content that's coming out from all of these DSPs. I mean, almost daily, to the biggest ones, Spotify, Deezer, whatever it might be. I'm not even talking about the AI stuff. It's got to be harder and harder to get yourself discovered these days. That just given that anyone can publish.
Yeah, it is. That's why artists nowadays build their own teams. Back in the day, as long as you had a manager or maybe a lawyer, you would be fine. Now, and it's my recommendation when I meet with young up and coming artists, build your own team. And if you see the management companies, the powerful ones here in the Latin space, you go to a management company here and it feels like you're at a record label because they have a person handling publicity, a person handling touring, a person handling brands. So they've assumed the role of what the record companies used to do 25 years ago.
This is a really interesting thing because I don't know. I mean, I think the Latin markets have some differentiation, and I know a bunch of the ones that you probably know very well. Obviously, Westwood came out of Sony and places like Magnus and Walter
Hmm.
Combs Company, and
Hmm.
these are things that are, you're right. I think that they're super powerful and act in different ways than just classic management companies. I don't know if we have that here in the same way in LA as the Latin markets do, but I think that's a super important piece that you're raising. So we did something pretty special. I think it was 17 years ago, 18 years ago. It was
2007. 2007, that big worldwide arena tour set.
I was running Sony's digital business and building the region's digital business for the first time. all sorts of, stuff that we thought was really important, partnering with mobile carriers like Telcel and Telefonica,
Mhm.
selling ringtones, setting up, first generations of Apple stores, first Spotify, all that stuff, which was, sitting in rooms, negotiating deal terms, classic stuff, licensing and selling your music, telling the New Yorkers what the right revenue splits could be and how that was in sync with the strategy, all that good stuff. But I was in this meeting 2006, 2007.
The meeting started. We first met in 2006 because we were just releasing the Unplugged. Everything came out in 2007 for the tour. But I remember we started talking in 2006 around the release of the Unplugged set.
And this was Unplugged, for those of you who don't know, this was an MTV kind of like concept. I don't know if it's still
Mhm.
around, where artists would kind of kick off their shoes, play acoustic sets in their flip flops and their flannels, and kick back.
MTV Unplugged was the Tiny Desk of its day because Tiny Desk is the new MTV Unplugged, where
Excellent.
every artist wants to do Tiny Desk. And when the Tiny Desk show is done good, it's a home run.
And this was English and Latin, and
Mhm.
the classic being like Nirvana Unplugged. And we at Sony Latin had a deal with MTV at the time. Our good friend Jose Tian, who's produced
Mhm.
so many artists, was part of the talent relations team, and great people like Mark Zimmett. And there was this record that had been out with Ricky doing it Unplugged. In Miami, and I think this is also different, by the way, than in the U.S. market. I actually knew my Sony colleagues. Like I knew
Mhm.
Sony Pictures, Sony TV. Sony had a mobile phone at the time, which was super bleeping cool. Sony
Mhm.
Ericsson phones, they're, I think, for the most part, gone. And we used to not only know each other and hang out, but we actually used to try and help each other. And like we would do the stuff that big corporates are supposed to do. I mean, I don't know if I'd ever meet a Sony Ericsson person if I was working in LA.
Mhm.
I certainly wouldn't have met an artist or a manager like you sitting in Sony Music in New York. And I was sitting in this Sony Ericsson meeting, and they were showing me this phone that they had done for an artist who was on a label called EMI at the time. And for those of you who are not of a certain age, EMI was the crown jewel of England's record labels. Everyone from Radiohead to Katy
Mhm.
Perry to the Beatles were on EMI. And they had an artist named Robbie Williams, who a lot of you should know. And they had done this phone for Robbie, and it was like the coolest thing. It looked like a wedding combined with a marketing campaign combined with a whatever. It was called a preloaded phone, and they had plastered this thing all over Latin America, and I was like, "What the hell is that? I want to do that," And they said, "Well, who have you got? Who's your biggest artist?" And I said, "Well, let me see if I can bring it to Ricky's team, to Bruno." Because I think one thing that's very special about Bruno still is that he
Yes.
can see a lot of sides of things. And so we created this phone together, the Ricky Martin phone, where we preloaded a bunch of content on it. And from the MTV Unplugged, which Sony's lawyers sent me over to MTV to get approval on. And I had to do a trade-off that was like,
Mhm.
kind of like when Manhattan was sold. The MTV said, "What's a preloaded phone? Will you let us sell ringtones in Central America in exchange for us giving you the rights to put it on the phone?" And I said,
Mhm.
"God bless, knock yourself out."
Mhm.
And so me and someone who's supposed to be my financial analyst went to hang with Bruno and your artist, Ricky, in a studio before he was going on tour. And we had Ricky talk about the Blanco y Negro tour, what it meant to him in both English and Spanish. And we crafted some content for the phone. And we preloaded an album as well as pieces of an album on different phones. And I, of course, asked Sony for money, Sony Ericsson. And I remember months of debate on how we got to the pricing of that. I was like, "Look, just give me this amount of money per phone and
Mhm.
that amount." And I still remember driving the CD over to the driveway of Sony Ericsson's office and giving it to their head of marketing. It's, "Go ahead." That was how sophisticated the distribution was for us. And I remember our lawyers in New York and my boss, the CEO, saying, "What is a preloaded phone? What exactly are you doing? We don't have anything in our contracts for that." And we figured out a
Mhm.
way to just create a massive deal around it. Endorsement for Ricky, but also a way to sell the content for Sony. I think we sold 1.5 million phones
Mhm.
in Mexico when he went on tour, and about a throughout the region, and we did it again with Shakira actually about a year later, and it was a lot of fun and something I look back on fondly, well before others like you too tried it actually.
For us, it was a win-win, Seth. When you proposed the idea, I thought, wow, technology, because we knew it was everything was headed that way, right? At that time, ringtones. The iPhone did not debut till 2007, so we were ahead of that. I figured
Mm,
this is a win-win. We're going to go out
yeah.
on a worldwide arena tour. We do need a title sponsor. Sony Ericsson's a great brand for us to be associated with, so we didn't really see any downsides. And when I talked to Ricky about it and said, yeah, I'll do whatever content we need to do, it was a win-win. There was no downside whatsoever for us.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I mean, I don't know if that is even something that can be done these days because I think the App Store killed a lot of this stuff off, if you will. But
Yeah.
it was a ton of fun, and I think maybe for this audience today, when you think about the markets outside of streaming, I mean, are there special things like that you're seeing? I mean, with technology, with brands, with things that you would ally with or
Mhm.
endorse with that are obviously attractive financially to you, but might be kind of ambitious to do as well.
The brand space is still fairly big in Latin America, Seth, because there's so much disposable income down there, especially in the big markets. We're looking at technology, and we're looking at now the streaming platforms, Netflix and HBO and Paramount. They seem to have money, and they want to invest in content, right? So South
Mm.
America as a continent, the revenues are going to reach $19 billion in the next 3 or 4 years, uh,
Woo.
because there's just so much
Yeah.
competition for video streaming, right? So what do? They all need content, and it's music content, it's drama, it's non-scripted, it's documentaries and all that. So they're all coming to us now. The Netflix and Warner Brothers and Hulu, Disney's, and Paramounts. So we're seeing a huge avenue open up. Back then, there wasn't anything. Remember, Seth, you'd have to go to Mexico, do Televisa, and maybe they wouldn't pay. Maybe they'd pay your,
Right.
hotel or whatever. Same in Brazil or Argentina. Now it's different. Now they have big bucks.
Well, that's cool. And I know Ricky's done some stuff. Was it Palm Beach? The show with Apple he's done as well. There's been plenty of
Yeah,
opportunities that are outside the pure scope of music and recorded music, I
yeah,
guess as
yeah.
well,
I mean,
right?
Ricky's done Palm Royale. He did Johnny Versace. He did Glee, and he's working on several others. But every artist, Maluma's done a bunch of stuff on film, TV. Maluma has his
Yeah.
own production company now, film and TV production company. Shakira's done a bunch of stuff. So we're seeing artists realize that area of the video streaming business is
Yeah.
growing, and there's money, and it helped their exposure as well.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And we didn't really touch too deeply on it, but you've worked with creative artists as well the
Mhm.
past few years in Latin. So sounds like you've got the agency headset that is still very much on, right? And that
Yeah.
sounds like that entrepreneurial mindset is just as important in Latin markets for anyone. Yeah.
What I took to creative artists when I joined, 12 years ago, it was, agents are very, very tunnel vision about something, right? Getting the deal done. Managers have to think big picture 360, right? So as a manager, because that's been my background, I've always thought 360 out of the box and everything else. So I took that let's think out of the box concept, the CAA idea, way of operating. That's when we built the Latin division, right? Which is still going out of LA now.
Mm.
But I think that's what's helped me because I think more like a manager. And as a manager, you really, like I said, have to have the entire puzzle out in front of you and see how you're going to make all the pieces fit together.
I really appreciate you taking time, today on this. I mean, maybe just as we sign off, just the briefest bit of what the current focus is on right now, and where can people follow what you're doing or your artists are doing? Where's the best way to look for that?
Right now, it's Instagram. For us, it's Instagram. Websites are not what they used to be, Seth. And obviously, I don't know
Yeah,
anybody who uses email anymore in our business, especially in Latin America. It's all WhatsApp. It's all WhatsApp in Latin America, right? But Instagram's probably the best way. And our artists have actually learned as well to they're handling their own Instagram posts. So now you don't even have the filter of a publicist. It's all the artist doing everything himself or herself.
yeah. No, definitely a new world. So we'll make sure everyone knows that.
Mhm.
So look, everyone, special thanks to everyone for tuning in today. We're going to be doing these very regularly. So, if you enjoyed this one, subscribe to us to make sure you catch our next drop. Bruno, big thanks to you, brother. Okay, really appreciate it. We'll
Thank
catch
you, Seth.
everyone next time, and thanks for listening in.